The fog thickened as Kaori adjusted her coat, standing alone on the edge of the forgotten hamlet. She had arrived ahead of the team, driven by an impulse she couldn't name. The trees loomed like watchful giants, and the gravel beneath her boots gave way with a reluctant crunch. It was as if the land itself was whispering a warning. The wind curled through broken shutters and rattled hollow window panes, carrying distant sounds that could have been voices or just memories waiting to be remembered. Kaori had always been the quiet one on expeditions, meticulous, insightful, and often the last to speak, but the first to act when it mattered. She joined this mission for the same reason as the others, to uncover the truth about the lost 19th century explorer, Alaric Voss. But her reasons ran deeper, stained by a personal tragedy that still clung to her like a second skin. She hadn't told the others about the letter, about the photograph tucked inside. A photograph of Alaric. Yes, but standing beside someone who looked hauntingly like her. The village emerged like a phantom. From the mist buildings sagged with age, their stonework blistered and peeling, wooden beams jutting out like broken bones. The silence was unnatural, an oppressive blanket that muffled every step. Moss covered the cobblestones. The air smelled of mildew and old secrets, and every window stared with hollow eyes. Kaori hesitated before entering, her breath curling into the fog, blending with it as if the air was alive and waiting to breathe her in. By the time the rest of the expedition team arrived, 4 seasoned explorers who had seen their share of ruins and mysteries, Kaori had already mapped part of the village's outer ring. They were a tight group, but something about this place began to loosen their trust. Evelyn, the linguist, kept pausing to listen, eyes narrowing at faint murmurs. Gregor, their skeptic and structural expert, muttered curses every time a door resisted or a floorboard groaned. Henry and Maya, the historians, walked closer together than usual, as if their shared knowledge couldn't protect them from the unknown. Their temporary base became the manor at the heart of the village, a crumbling estate that had once belonged to Alaric himself. Ivy strangled its facade, creeping across the cracked stone like veins of rot. Inside, the rooms were endless and disorienting, walls lined with portraits so faded that faces seemed to flicker between features. As Kaori walked through the central hall, a great chandelier loomed overhead, dangling slightly, as if perpetually on the verge of collapse. Every creak echoed like footsteps. They split into pairs to explore. Kaori and Evelyn took the west wing, where ornate furniture sat under dusty sheets like corpses in linen shrouds. The mirrors along the walls were veiled, some cracked in spiderweb patterns, others disturbingly pristine. "Do you hear that?" Evelyn whispered. Pausing by a door etched with unfamiliar runes, Kaori nodded. There was something, a faint humming, like a lullaby played backward, drifting just at the edge of perception. It grew stronger the closer they moved to the old study. The study was colder than the rest of the manor, its fireplace unused, but filled with scorched bones of burnt documents. Books lined every shelf, many locked shut with rusted clasps. On the desk sat a thick journal bound in cracked leather and secured with a frayed cord. Kaori's fingers trembled as she untied it. The pages were brittle, some smudged with ink, others meticulously written. The first entry chilled her. To break the chain, one must first wear it. To know the truth is to belong to it. Night fell quickly in the hamlet, and the fog outside glowed silver under the moonlight. The team reconvened by the manor's hearth, lighting a fire that hissed and spat like something offended. They shared finding symbols etched into doorframes, journals that mentioned the Veiled One, and maps that led nowhere. Gregor spoke about strange dips in the manor's architecture, as if rooms had been added and then erased. Henry grew pale as he read aloud a passage referencing bloodless deaths and waking grief. Sleep came uneasily. Kaori chose a small room off the eastern corridor, once a servant's quarters, sparse but untouched. The air inside was still, almost reverent. She sat on the narrow bed, clutching the photograph again. Alaric Voss stood in front of the manor, coat buttoned to the neck, and next to him, a woman with her eyes shadowed. No name, no date, but Corey had seen that face before, every time she looked in a mirror. A distant cousin? A dream? Or was time playing its own tricks here? That night, Corey dreamt of the forest. She walked barefoot among the trees, their branches lowering like arms to embrace her. Voices whispered above in a forgotten tongue. She came to a clearing where the air shimmered with a sickly green hue. In its center stood the chapel, its steeple broken, its stained glass weeping light. She approached the door, heart pounding. Before she could open it, she heard a soft voice behind her, calling her name with unbearable sadness. She turned and woke in darkness. Kaori sat up in her bed, the image of the dream lingering in her bones like cold water. The fog pressed against the windows from the outside, as if trying to seep through the cracks. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and lit a lantern. The manor was still, but not quiet. Somewhere above, floorboards creaked under unseen weight. She opened her door into the hallway, half expecting to see someone. But the corridor was empty, except for the slow swing of a curtain at the far end. Unable to sleep, Kaori wandered. She found herself drawn toward the chapel on the outskirts of the village, the same one from her dream. It stood crookedly beneath a slanting hill, encased in vines, its door broken off its hinges. The moonlight glinted through the remnants of stained glass, casting fractured colors onto the stone floor. Inside, pews were overturned and rotting, but the altar remained intact, covered in carvings of eyes and spirals that made Kaori dizzy to stare at for too long. At the back of the chapel, a trapdoor lay partially open. Kaori hesitated, feeling the weight of ice on her. Though she saw no one, her lantern flickered. Against her better judgment, she descended the narrow wooden steps. The cellar below was musty and lined with shelves filled, not with wine or sacred objects, but with personal items, lockets, dolls, cracked glasses, and small labeled jars of earth. Each bore a name etched into metal tags. One of them read, Kaori Ainsley, to be collected. She staggered back, breath hitching. Her name wasn't common, and the date scratched below it matched the current year. Heart pounding, Kaori grabbed the jar, turned it over in her hands. The earth inside shifted as if unsettled. She ran back up the steps, pushing through the chapel's door into the cold night. The fog greeted her like a wall. But this time it felt closer, clinging to her like a presence rather than a vapor. From behind her, deep within the chapel, came a faint sound, like someone softly weeping. Back at the manor, Kaori hid the jar in her bag. She didn't tell the others. Something had changed since her discovery. She noticed how the air seemed heavier, how shadows lingered longer than they should. Evelyn asked her the next morning if she was feeling well, her gaze fixed and worried. Kaori lied. The truth would sound insane. But as they resumed exploration, she realized her silence had a cost, because the others were hearing things too. And one by one, they were beginning to slip. Maya disappeared first. During a survey of the village square, she turned a corner behind the general store and never returned. The team searched for hours, yelling her name until their voices broke. They found her notebook, lying open to a page filled with looping script. Not her handwriting, not in any language they knew. It kept writing itself, even as they watched. Gregor slammed it shut and burned it in the manor's hearth. The flames hissed blue, and for a moment, Maya's laughter echoed from inside them. Panic took hold. Arguments sparked over what to do next. Henry insisted they leave, but the road had vanished, subsumed by the mist, which now ringed the village like a living barricade. Gregor grew erratic, sketching maps of impossible hallways he claimed were beneath the manor. Evelyn cried in her sleep, speaking fluently in Old Latin, though she had never studied it. Kaori watched it all unfold, keeping the jar close, unable to shake the feeling that everything was somehow meant to happen this way. That night, Kaori ventured alone into the manor's attic, compelled by the journal she had kept reading in secret. The entries began to feel personal, as if written to her. "You are the key," one passage said. "She watches from the other side of glass." The attic was choked with dust and cobwebs, filled with trunks and broken furniture. In the farthest corner stood a mirror unlike the others, unbroken, wrapped in velvet. She removed the cover, and for a second, her reflection didn't move with her. Her other self looked back with hollow eyes, lips moving silently. Kaori leaned closer, trying to decipher the unheard words. Behind the reflection, in the mirrored manor, stood figures cloaked in shadow. Dozens of them, just beyond the glass. One reached forward and pressed its palm to the surface. Kaori mirrored the gesture. For a second, her fingers met cold, not glass, but skin. She recoiled, falling backward into dust. The mirror remained blank now, only her own wide-eyed reflection staring back. She didn't tell the others about the mirror. Fear had turned inward now, feeding on memory and intuition. That night, while the others slept, Kaori opened the jar. The soil inside was not ordinary. It pulsed slightly, like it remembered touch. She buried it under a tree near the manor, whispering her name over it, unsure why. As she covered the hole, wind rushed through the trees above, and for a brief moment she heard a woman's voice beside her, low and mournful. Too late to turn back. The next morning, Evelyn was gone. No scream, no struggle, only a trail of wet footprints that led from her room to the east wing, ending abruptly in front of a bricked-over archway none of them had noticed before. Kaori stared at it in disbelief. There was no mortar, no cracks. It looked ancient, as though it had stood sealed for centuries. And yet the trail was fresh, the moisture still clinging to the stone. Henry traced the wall with trembling fingers. "It's like she walked into it," he whispered. Kaori couldn't deny it any longer. This place wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It remembered. The manor itself was alive in a way that defied logic, shifting to fit the sorrow it housed, as if feeding off the pain of those who entered. She spent that evening in the study, poring through Alaric's journal. The further she read, the more the entries changed, from field notes to desperate ramblings. He wrote of a convergence, of souls binding to place, and of a mirror self lost to the curse. Gregor was the last to fall. He began whispering to someone none of them could see, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to nod or laugh softly. He refused to eat. He walked the halls at night with a candle, murmuring phrases in a language that was probably never human. When Kaori confronted him, he simply smiled. "You're lucky," he said. "It wants you whole." "Me?" I'm already in pieces." That night, he vanished. The next morning, the team's compass spun aimlessly, and the manor had gained another hallway. Now only Kari and Henry remained. The village outside was still cloaked in mist, but something had shifted. Shapes moved within it now, flickering at the edges of vision, tall, thin, impossibly still, until they chose not to be. The village clock tower, long thought broken, now ticked in reverse. Each chime made the air ripple. Henry, pale and worn, suggested they burn the manor down. Cowrie shook her head. "This place doesn't fear fire," she said. "It's built from something older than wood." Cowrie had started dreaming again. But this time, she did not wake in terror. The woman from the photograph appeared nightly now, leading her through corridors that didn't exist in the real manor. They passed by rooms where shadows wept and doors that bled smoke. The woman never spoke, but her sadness was a storm. On the third dream, she pointed at Cowrie's chest. When Cowrie looked down, she saw a key sewn into her skin, twisting gently, as if unlocking her from the inside. The next day, Corey followed instinct alone. Henry begged her not to, but she returned to the chapel with the key from her dream drawn in charcoal on her palm. The trapdoor was closed now, no wind, no sound, but when she approached, it opened on its own. This time, the cellar was different. There were no jars, no shelves, just a stone basin in the center of the room, filled with water so dark it mirrored the ceiling perfectly. Cowrie peered into it and saw the manor burning in reverse, flames being swallowed. From behind her, the weeping started again. But it wasn't sad, it was angry. Shapes coalesced in the shadows, whispering her name, not with affection, but hunger. Cowrie stood her ground. "I'm not here to feed you," she said, voice shaking. "I'm here to understand." The darkness paused. Then, one of the figures stepped forward. The woman from the mirror. Her face was clearer now. It was Kari, older, hollow-eyed. She reached into the basin and offered a stone tablet, covered in ancient writing. Kari took the tablet, and the room shuddered. The figure faded. The weeping stopped. Upstairs, the manor groaned as if in protest. Cowrie returned to find Henry waiting, pale and terrified. "You were gone for 2 days," he said. She didn't believe him until she looked at the sky. 2 suns had passed, yet she hadn't aged. The tablet now pulsed with warmth, the symbols rearranging themselves. She watched in awe and dread as they formed a single sentence in a language only her blood understood. What was lost must be returned through sacrifice. Henry didn't like the sound of it. "We need to go," he insisted. But Cowrie wasn't listening. The tablet resonated with something deep within her, a memory she didn't own, a promise made by someone who shared her face long ago. She now believed the village was a prison, but also a test. Those who entered were judged, their guilt or innocence shaped into illusions. But some, like Kari, were bound by something more: inheritance. That night, as Henry slept restlessly, Cowrie stood beneath the stained glass of the chapel, the tablet in her hands. The moonlight turned the glass, red, gold, and blue. She knew what needed to be done, though she feared it. The village wasn't cursed, it was mourning. It needed closure, a soul to carry the burden, to unmake the mirror world holding it in grief. Kaori pressed the tablet to her chest and whispered, "Take what's mine." The wind surged and the chapel trembled. The ground opened like a mouth. The earth beneath Kaori's feet gave way not with violence, but with sorrow, like a sigh too long held. She fell into darkness, not cold, but dense with memory. The whispers of the village swirled around her, forming shapes. Children playing in the manor halls, a woman clutching a locket, Alaric kneeling at an altar, pleading to a god long since forgotten. Then, the darkness began to pull apart, and Kaori stood once more. Only now, in the mirrored version of the hamlet, where everything was too quiet, too still. Here, the village was whole, no decay, no moss, no rot. But it was wrong. The buildings were pristine, but they shimmered like mirages. The trees didn't rustle. The sky was a pale void. Kaori walked through the empty streets, guided by instinct, the tablet warm in her hands. The ghosts didn't hide here. They watched openly, each wearing a face she recognized. Friends, family, even people she'd seen only in photographs. At the heart of it all stood the mirror manor, majestic and glowing with soft, sick light. Inside, the woman waited. The other Kaori. Her eyes held centuries. She spoke for the first time, voice rich with grief. "You were never meant to find us," she said. "But you did." Kaori stepped closer, unsure of whether to fear her or mourn her. "What is this place?" she asked. The other turned toward the mirror fireplace, where no fire burned. "It's what remains when truth is refused. We were the first to enter. We tried to take what was never meant to be found. We became the curse." The other Kaori led her to the great hall, where shadows clung to the rafters like memories too stubborn to die. In the center stood a circle etched into the marble floor symbols, identical to the ones carved into the chapel walls. "One must remain," the other said. "One must choose to carry what the others would bury." Kaori understood then. Each expedition, each disappearance had fed this cycle. The village didn't kill them, it kept them. Fragments of guilt, curiosity, love, all sealed in silence. The mirror Kaori reached out, offering her hand. "If you take my place, I can let go." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a plea. It was an offering of purpose, of ending. Kaori's hand trembled as she reached forward. As their fingers touched, a surge of memories poured into her. Alaric's final moments, Evelyn's screams swallowed by silence, Maya's despair, Gregor's unraveling mind. And behind it all, the first sin Alaric breaking the seal beneath the chapel, thinking he could rewrite death itself. Kaori let go. "I'm not here to replace you," she said. "I'm here to finish what you began." The other Kaori wept silently as she stepped back, fading with each breath. The manor around them began to dissolve, the perfection crumbling like ash. Kaori took the tablet, placed it into the center of the ritual circle, and spoke the names of the lost: Evelyn, Maya, Gregor, Henry, Alaric, and finally her own. The symbols flared once, bright as a star, before vanishing. The weight lifted, but the cost lingered. She awoke outside the chapel, lying in the dew-soaked grass beneath a grey dawn sky. The fog was gone. Birds sang cautiously from the trees. The village was still empty, but no longer felt watchful. The shadows had receded, the air cleansed of its sorrow. Kaori stood, unsure how long she had slept, if sleep was even the right word. The jar she had buried was gone, so was the tablet. But in her hand, she found the old photograph again. Now, the woman beside Alaric smiled, and she looked like herself. Henry emerged from the manor, eyes wide, relief pouring from him like water. He ran to her, grasping her shoulders. "Where did you go?" "I searched everywhere." Kaori didn't answer, not with words. She just embraced him, and for the first time since they arrived, they felt human again. As they prepared to leave, they found a narrow trail leading from the village to the edge of the forest, one that hadn't been there before. It welcomed them like a forgotten dream remembered at last. They walked in silence, the trees no longer looming, but standing tall in solemn witness. At the edge of the woods, Kaori looked back once more. The hamlet sat under the rising sun, quiet and still. Not cursed, not haunted, just resting. She knew others would come someday. Curious hearts always do, but the village would no longer need to feed on sorrow. She had given it what it lacked. Remembrance, not forgetting. And in doing so, she had freed the lost. Years later, Kaori would write of the expedition in fragments. Never the full story, never the full truth. Some things were too sacred to explain. The village faded from maps again, and that was how it should be. But sometimes, when fog rolls in, thick over hills, she still hears the chapel bell tolling faintly through memory. Not as a warning, but as a farewell. Ghosts, after all, are not always enemies. Sometimes they are simply echoes, waiting for someone to listen.